Are you ready to explore how one man captured 90% of an entire industry? I mean, just imagine waking up and finding out one single person controls the lifeblood of the global economy.
Yeah, it sounds like a comic book villain, right? But going through the massive stack of sources you sent us today, it is strictly historical fact.
Right, and we are using this research to kick off our new series, Oilfield Legends: Roughnecks, Risks, and Riches. So our mission today is doing a deep dive into your sources for The Man Who Owned Oil, how Rockefeller built Standard Oil's unstoppable empire.
Exactly.
And hey, real quick, if you enjoy this deep dive and want to hear more of this series, please remember to hit that like and subscribe button right now. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, checking the financial news, and finding out that that one single person controls 90% of an entire global industry.
Yeah, that's just it's almost impossible to picture today.
Right. I mean, we're not talking about some state-run enterprise or some shadowy international cartel. We're talking about one private citizen dictating the supply, the pricing, literally the distribution of a resource that every single person relies on to live their daily lives.
Exactly. Because, we operate in this era of incredibly complex global supply chains and stringent government regulations. But there was actually a time in American history when that level of singular, absolute control wasn't just some hypothetical scenario. It was the reality of the economy.
And the man who held that control, obviously, was John D. Rockefeller. The industry was oil. So today we're taking a deep dive into a historical script titled The Man Who Owned Oil.
It's a really fascinating source to dig into.
It really is.
Yeah.
And our mission here is to essentially trace the anatomy of a monopoly. We want to unpack the psychological makeup of Rockefeller, decode the absolute chaos of the early oil industry, and explore how Standard Oil basically wrote the playbook for modern big business.
Yeah, because the corporate structures, the supply chain strategies, the very way massive tech and retail conglomerates operate today, it all traces back to the systems he invented.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how someone manages to conquer an entire industry, you can't just look at the corporate structure they built.
No, not at all. You really have to look at the architect himself. Standard Oil was, in almost every conceivable way, a direct projection of John D. Rockefeller's unique psychology.
Right.
Which was, forged by some pretty deep contradictions in his childhood.
Yeah, the sources are very clear on this.
Yeah.
We'll start in 1839 in upstate New York. And Rockefeller is born into this family dynamic that is just incredibly polarized.
No.
On one hand, you have his father, William. By all accounts, William was a traveling salesman, but functionally, he was a con man.
A literal snake oil salesman, yeah.
Exactly. He peddled fake botanical cancer cures, he would vanish for months on end, and he just lived this life defined by deception and instability. The source even mentions he was indicted for rape at one point, though never convicted, before finally just abandoning the family entirely.
And that kind of profound instability, that leaves a lasting mark on a child. But then you look at his mother, Eliza. She was the absolute inverse of William.
Complete opposites.
Totally. She was deeply religious, heavily involved in the Baptist church, incredibly frugal, and just rigidly disciplined. Because William was frequently gone, Eliza had to hold the family together on pennies.
Wow.
So she instilled these two permanent philosophies into young John. First, you work relentlessly, and second, you never waste a single fraction of a cent.
So if you analyze Rockefeller's eventual business persona, it makes perfect sense. He's basically the ultimate hybrid of those two extremes.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.
He possessed the ruthless audacity and ambition of his con man father, fused perfectly with the obsessive, meticulous discipline of his pious mother.
And that discipline manifests remarkably early. From the time he was a teenager, Rockefeller kept a personal ledger book that he famously called Ledger A. He treated this little book with almost religious reverence.
Right. He recorded everything, every penny he earned and every penny he spent. And he was recording his charitable Baptist tithes right alongside his earnings, donating to charity from his very first paycheck.
Yeah, he was incredibly methodical.
But wait, when you read about Ledger A, it feels less like a diary of wealth and more like a tool for, psychological survival.
Precisely. When you grow up with a father who represents total unpredictability and abandonment, you crave stability. For Rockefeller, that ledger represented order.
He valued order and control above all else.
Right. He was a human calculator. By the time he was 16, working as a bookkeeper at a produce trading company in Cleveland, he was already finding ways to streamline their accounting. He brought that exact same obsessive precision to everything.
Oh, there's a famous story from his later years that illustrates this perfectly, right? The drops of solder story.
Yes, this is the perfect example of his mindset. He was touring one of his oil facilities and noticed how they were sealing the 5-gallon tin cans of oil for export. He asked the foreman exactly how many drops of solder they used to seal the cans. The foreman said 40.
And Rockefeller asks him to try 38 drops.
Exactly. 38 leaked, so they tried 39. And 39 drops sealed the can perfectly. So Rockefeller mandated that all cans be sealed with 39 drops from then on.
Wow, just over 1 drop.
Yeah. In the first year, that saved him $2,500. Over the lifetime of his export business, that single drop of solder saved him hundreds of thousands of dollars.
He didn't just track his money, he literally engineered efficiency to dominate. So by his early 20s, he's running his own successful commodity trading partnership. He's disciplined, he's flush with cash, and he is looking for an opportunity. Then in 1859, everything changes.
Right, the Drake well.
Edwin Drake drills the first commercially successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, which is only about 100 miles from Cleveland.
Yeah, and people had been using surface oil for a long time as a lubricant, or skimming it off creeks. But Drake's well proved a revolutionary concept. You could extract petroleum in massive volumes from underground reservoirs. The reaction to this was just instantaneous.
Northwestern Pennsylvania turns into a total frenzy. Boom towns are springing out of the mud in a matter of days. Drilling rigs are going up everywhere, and massive fortunes are being made and lost almost weekly.
It was incredibly volatile. The price of crude oil would swing wildly based on sudden surges in supply or dry spells. A driller could strike a massive reservoir on a Tuesday, become a millionaire on paper, and then go completely bankrupt by Friday when the market flooded and the price collapsed to pennies.
But wait, this brings up a major question for me. If there's so much money to be made in the actual drilling, why did a guy who was so clearly obsessed with building an empire completely avoid pulling the oil out of the ground himself? He lived right next door to the biggest resource boom in American history, and he just watched it happen.
Well, what's fascinating here is you have to go back to Ledger A. You have to remember his deep psychological need for control. Rockefeller looked at the Pennsylvania oil fields, and he didn't see a golden opportunity. He saw chaos.
Oh, right.
He despised the gambler's mentality of the drilling boom. It was entirely unpredictable. You never knew if a well would gush or go completely dry, and you just cannot model that kind of unpredictability on a spreadsheet.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You can't put a wild, uncontrollable geyser into a neat little column in a ledger.
So his solution was to bypass the source entirely and focus on the bottleneck refining. Crude oil straight out of the ground is relatively useless for the average consumer. It had to be refined into kerosene, which was rapidly taking over as the primary fuel for lighting American homes.
Okay, so he realizes the power didn't lie with the people taking the risk to find the oil. The power lay with whoever processed and transported it.
Exactly.
And he chooses to do this in Cleveland rather than in the Pennsylvania boom towns.
Yeah.
Geographically, that seems like a detour, but from a strategic standpoint, it was brilliant. Cleveland had access to Lake Erie and the Erie Canal, but more importantly, it had incredible access to multiple competing railroad lines.
That competition between the railroads was the key. In 1863, he invests in his first refinery. Within 2 years, he buys out his partners and takes absolute control. But he quickly realizes that the refining business has its own kind of chaos.
Right, because everyone is trying to refine it.
Exactly. There were dozens of small refiners competing against each other, driving profit margins down to razor-thin levels, and they were all at the mercy of the railroad companies, who charged wildly unpredictable shipping rates.
So Rockefeller sees this chaotic market, and he decides the only way to survive is to impose his own order on it. In 1870, he officially incorporates Standard Oil of Ohio. He brings in a handful of partners, most notably a man named Henry Flagler. And Flagler seems to be the logistical architect behind what happens next.
Yeah, Flagler was the mastermind behind their transportation strategy. Together, they realized that to conquer the refining market, they needed unprecedented scale. If Standard Oil refined more volume than anyone else, they could guarantee the railroads a steady, massive flow of freight.
A volume discount?
Sort of, but in exchange for this guaranteed traffic, Flagler went to the railroads and negotiated secret rebates.
Okay, so they would pay the public shipping rate, but then the railroad would privately hand a portion of that money right back to Standard Oil. That alone is a massive competitive advantage. You are artificially lowering your operating costs while your competitors are paying full price.
It was a huge advantage. They argued it was fair because they were providing the railroads with efficiency, acting as eveners who ensured the trains were always full. But the strategy evolved into something far more predatory in 1872 with this secret alliance known as the South Improvement Company scheme.
Right.
This is the moment where Standard Oil's tactics really crossed the line from tough negotiation into outright economic warfare.
Yeah, the South Improvement Company is genuinely shocking to read about. Standard Oil gets together with the major railroads to give rebates to a select few large refiners and simultaneously raise the public shipping rates for everyone else. But getting a discount wasn't enough for Rockefeller. He demanded, and actually received, something called drawbacks.
And drawbacks are the crucial mechanism here. A drawback meant that Standard Oil would not only get a discount on their own shipments, but they would receive a cut of the shipping fees paid by their competitors.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To put this in modern terms for you, the listener, imagine you own an independent local coffee shop. You're trying to compete with a massive global coffee chain across the street. Every single time you pay a delivery fee to have coffee beans brought to your store, 10% of your delivery fee is secretly routed directly to the bank account of the mega chain across the street.
Yeah.
Your competitors are quite literally subsidizing your own corporate expansion every time they try to do business.
It is an inescapable trap. I mean, how could you possibly compete?
You can't.
Right. The legal justification Standard Oil used was murky at best. They essentially argued that providing information and maintaining market equilibrium justified the fee. But in reality, it was pure coercion. And when word of the South Improvement Company scheme inevitably leaked to the public, the independent drillers and small refiners in Pennsylvania were just outraged. They organized embargoes. The public pressure was so intense that the railroads backed down. And on paper, the scheme collapsed before it even formally began.
But the genius, if you want to call it that, of Rockefeller, was that he didn't even need this scheme to actually go into effect. He used the mere threat of it. He walked into the offices of his rivals in Cleveland, laid out the reality of the situation, and basically offered to buy them out with Standard Oil stock or cash.
And they were terrified. They knew that if the railroads turned against them, their businesses would be completely worthless in a matter of months. So they sold. This triggered what history calls the Cleveland Massacre. In a span of just 6 weeks in 1872, Rockefeller bought out 22 of his 26 local rivals.
6 weeks to conquer an entire city's refining capacity. That's just wild. And from there, Standard Oil just scales that exact same playbook nationally. Throughout the 1870s, they systematically target independent refiners in other cities.
And he didn't just stop at horizontal expansion, buying up other refineries. He essentially invented the modern concept of vertical integration. Standard Oil recognized that relying on outside vendors for any step of the process was a vulnerability.
Right.
So they bought the pipelines to bypass the railroads entirely. They bought the tank cars, they bought the storage warehouses, they even bought the chemical plants that made the acid used in refining.
They even bought the physical timber forests to secure the wood and the cooperage plants to build their own barrels. They internalized every single cost.
Because of this vertical integration, if an independent competitor refused to sell to Standard Oil, Rockefeller could employ predatory pricing. He would drop the price of kerosene in that specific local market below the actual cost of production, operating at a loss until the competitor bled dry and went bankrupt.
And Standard Oil could absorb the temporary loss because they were incredibly profitable everywhere else. So by 1880, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining in the United States.
But running a national empire of that scale creates a massive logistical and legal nightmare. You have to look at the legal framework of the 19th century. Back then, a corporation was chartered by a specific state, and they were generally forbidden from owning property or stock in companies located in other states.
So how does an Ohio-based company legally control a vast network of refineries, pipelines, and warehouses spread across Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey?
That was the operational problem. The legal solution they invented in 1882 was revolutionary, the Standard Oil Trust. Rockefeller and his legal team basically devised a massive loophole.
Okay.
The owners of all these various Standard Oil subsidiaries scattered across different states surrendered their shares to a central board of 9 trustees. Rockefeller, of course, was the head of this board.
So instead of Standard Oil of Ohio technically owning all these properties, which was illegal, these 9 men held the shares in trust for the stockholders. And in exchange, the original owners received trust certificates which paid dividends.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it allowed them to act as a single, coordinated, unified monopoly without ever having a formal national corporate charter. It completely bypassed state regulations, and this specific legal innovation changed the American economy forever.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if you are listening to this and wondering why we use the word antitrust to describe laws targeting tech monopolies or mega mergers today, this exact moment in 1882 is where that word originates. Almost overnight, the trust became the template for the Gilded Age. You saw the rise of the steel trusts, the sugar trusts, the tobacco trusts. Rockefeller provided the exact blueprint for how to circumvent the law and consolidate an entire sector.
But with that kind of power comes unprecedented scrutiny. I mean, you look at the political cartoons from this era, and they are drawing Standard Oil as a massive octopus. Its tentacles are wrapping around oil derricks, strangling competitors, and even wrapped around the U.S. Capitol building. Politicians are investigating him, newspapers are attacking him. So while political cartoonists are doing this, how is Rockefeller actually reacting to becoming the most hated man in business?
That's what's so interesting. While the entire country is furious about the great octopus, he is essentially living a very quiet, disciplined life. He goes to church, he plays golf, he plants trees on his estate. He completely insulates himself with his wealth and his absolute belief that he was doing the right thing.
Really? He thought he was the good guy?
Oh, definitely. He genuinely believed he had rescued the oil industry from wasteful chaos and brought order and affordable light to the world.
But the reckoning was coming. And it didn't start with a powerful senator or a rival tycoon. It started with a journalist named Ida Tarbell. And she had a deeply personal connection to this story, right? Her father was an independent oil producer in Pennsylvania. He was one of the many men whose livelihood was completely dismantled by Standard Oil's aggressive tactics.
She grew up watching her family and really her entire community get squeezed out of existence by Rockefeller's machine.
Wait, let me push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate for a second. Was Standard Oil actually doing something illegal during those early years, or were they just playing hardball better than anyone else? Like, if Tarbell's father was just a less efficient driller who couldn't match Standard Oil's scale, isn't that just the harsh reality of a free market at work? Why is that considered anti-competitive rather than just highly competitive?
Well, that is the exact defense Standard Oil used. They argued they simply built a better, more efficient mousetrap, but Tarbell's journalism exposed that it wasn't a free market at all.
Okay, how so?
Efficiency is finding a way to make a product cheaper and passing the savings to the consumer. What Standard Oil was doing with secret rebates, drawbacks, and predatory pricing was actively preventing competitors from even participating in the market. You can't have a free market if one player dictates the transportation costs for everyone else.
Ah, right, and Tarbell proved it. Starting in 1902, she publishes a landmark series of investigative articles in McClure's magazine. She doesn't just write angry opinion pieces, she uses Rockefeller's own weapon against him. She uses meticulous accounting.
Exactly. She spent years digging through obscure state testimonies, uncovering the hidden railroad contracts, documenting the secret negotiations, and laying bare the exact mechanics of the South Improvement Company and the trust.
Wow.
She translated complex corporate financial maneuvering into a narrative that the average American could understand and, get angry about.
It was devastating. Teddy Roosevelt later popularized the term muckraking for this kind of investigative journalism. Tarbell's work shifted public consciousness so drastically that the federal government was forced to act. In 1906, they filed a massive lawsuit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act.
And the Sherman Antitrust Act had been passed back in 1890, largely in response to public anger over companies exactly like Standard Oil. It broadly outlawed any contract, combination, or conspiracy and restraint of trade. But for years, it lacked real teeth.
Right.
The government had to prove that Standard Oil wasn't just big, but that it actively and unfairly blocked competitors from doing business.
And the legal battle was grueling. It wound its way through the federal courts for years. Finally, in 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its ruling.
The court established what became known as the rule of reason. They decided that being a monopoly in itself wasn't necessarily illegal, but engaging in unreasonable business practices to maintain that monopoly was.
Okay, so the predatory pricing and rebates finally caught up to them.
Exactly. Standard Oil's long history of predatory pricing, industrial espionage, and secret rebates proved they were an unreasonable monopoly. The court ordered Standard Oil to be broken up.
The great octopus was chopped into 34 separate independent companies. These fragments eventually became the modern energy titans we know today, companies like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Aramco. The government won. They shattered the monopoly. But history loves to serve up an ironic twist.
And it is perhaps the greatest irony in American business history. The breakup of Standard Oil actually made John D. Rockefeller exponentially wealthier.
Wait, how does that work mechanically? Because he didn't just have his company confiscated, right? He received proportionate shares in all 34 of the new independent successor companies.
Exactly. When Standard Oil was a single, massive monopoly, its true value was somewhat obscured, and investors were wary of the endless lawsuits. But when it was broken into 34 regional monopolies, the stock market could suddenly see exactly how immensely profitable the individual parts were.
Right.
And right around this time, the internal combustion engine was taking off. Cars were replacing horses. The demand for gasoline, which used to be a useless byproduct of kerosene refining, skyrocketed.
So all 34 companies start trading on the open market, and their collective value absolutely explodes. The sum of the parts turned out to be far more valuable than the whole. By some estimates, Rockefeller's net worth peaked after his monopoly was destroyed. The government's ultimate punishment accidentally turned him into the wealthiest private citizen in world history.
This raises an important question, right? Because he lived to be 97 years old, and he spent his final 4 decades primarily giving that massive fortune away. He funded medical research that helped eradicate hookworm in the South. He essentially built the University of Chicago from scratch, and he established philanthropic foundations that still operate today.
You really have to look at the totality of the man and the systems he built. Was he a ruthless monopolist who corrupted free markets? Yes. Was he a visionary who brought unprecedented efficiency to a chaotic industry and affordable energy to the masses? Also yes. The sources present a deeply complicated figure, but his impact on how we live is undeniable.
Absolutely. The strategies Standard Oil pioneered, vertical integration, massive economies of scale, navigating regulatory loopholes, are the exact strategies used by the most powerful corporations operating today. His need for order ultimately built the framework of the modern economy.
Which leaves us with a final thought to consider. Think back to that incredible statistic from the beginning. One private citizen controlling 90% of an industry. Every time you fill your gas tank, flip on a light, or see an Exxon sign, you are living in a world engineered by John D. Rockefeller. We look at the 1911 Supreme Court ruling as this great triumph of government regulation over corporate greed. But if the absolute ultimate punishment shattering the Standard Oil monopoly actually resulted in making Rockefeller the wealthiest private citizen in history, we have to ask ourselves, do modern antitrust laws actually punish corporate titans?
That's the real question.
Or when we force them to spin off their assets, do we just accidentally build them an even more profitable, highly diversified portfolio? Something to keep in mind the next time you see a massive tech or retail conglomerate facing a breakup. I mean, before Standard Oil, ordinary working families literally sat in the dark.
Because they couldn't afford expensive whale oil or candles, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Rockefeller was so relentlessly disciplined with his refining process that he drove the cost of kerosene down to just a fraction of a cent.
Oh.
Yeah, suddenly the working class could actually light their homes at night.
Plus, he employed tens of thousands of people and funded universities and medical research that saved lives. Okay, let's unpack this for a second. So the argument is that we actually need these rough players to drag society forward.
Yeah, I mean, if we connect this to the bigger picture, monopolies often form during massive technological leaps because incredible scale is just required to build new infrastructure.
Like Carnegie mass-producing steel for skyscrapers.
Right, or Vanderbilt knitting the country together with rail. Or even modern figures, like Jobs putting a supercomputer in your pocket, or Musk pushing space exploration.
So they play rough, but they build systems that permanently elevate the baseline of human life.
Exactly. They aren't saints, but they build things.
To understand how someone builds that kind of cutthroat discipline, you really have to look at the environment that raised them. The early oil industry wasn't a boardroom, it was a boomtown.
Oh, totally. It was a survival of the fittest environment. It was defined by mud, madness, and zero safety codes.
Just desperate men chasing fast money.
Yes, and operating under the constant, very real threat that the ground beneath their feet could literally explode.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. That explosive origin perfectly mirrors the modern economic struggle.
It really does.
The courtroom battles we see today over tech regulation are just the modern version of trying to tame the oil boomtowns.
Yeah, we are constantly trying to balance the raw, explosive energy of innovation with the necessary safety codes of a functioning society. It is a permanent tightrope walk.
So what does this all mean for you listening? The history of innovation is unbelievably messy. It forces us to constantly weigh the heavy cost of unchecked ambition against the undeniable, life-changing benefits of progress.
Which leaves us with a pretty difficult question to ponder.
Right. If the chaotic, unregulated boomtowns and ruthless tactics of the past were required to rapidly build the infrastructure of the modern world, could a truly fair, strictly regulated system ever produce a technological leap of that exact same magnitude?
It makes you wonder. I mean, maybe you just can't harness the power of an explosion if you insist on keeping the laboratory perfectly clean. Let's wrap up this episode. As always, thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode about the chaos of the oil field boomtowns. Until then, stay curious.